believe that the U.S. acted prudently. Donald Trump made a decision to end the Iran's nuclear enrichment capabilities, and that put us at a strategic advantage. We were able to negotiate terms for a settlement because Iran really does not have um, any influence in the region any longer without any nuclear capabilities and the way that its military has been degraded. It puts the United States in the driver's seat for negotiations, which is advantageous for us in a way that we can hopefully reshape the strategic environment and the security environment for the Middle East. I don't think they have an alternative. There's all of their cards are played. They don't really have any offensive capability that they can use against the United States or US troops. They can try to use their proxy forces, but like I've said in the past, they're really having an alignment for money and authority and power, and they're really not aligned with the Iranian regime and leadership any longer. Really don't have any either psychological ties to them. It was all about monetary, and without having the economic backing, without having the backing from being able to deliver munitions or arms or equipment, really there's no reason that they will align with Iran any longer. Sure. I'm not sure what the question was with regard to the continuation of the enrichment. From what I understand and from what's been put out in the press, and even President Trump's speech where he addressed the US, the assessment is that the enrichment capabilities are no longer, that they have been destroyed. Obviously, it may take some time to verify that, but from what has been reported, Iran no longer has a nuclear enrichment capability. I totally disagree. Um, the Middle East has been in chaos for centuries. This is nothing new. I believe, based upon what's happening now and what can happen in the future, that this can open the door for a region that is stable. More relationships between Saudi Arabia and Israel. We look at less conflict between Iraq and Iran. Look at Kurdistan coming into the fold with Iraq. There's so many factors and variables that are at play. Turkey's involvement, Syria's involvement, and with Iran no longer supporting a lot of these groups and organizations, they're going to have to find other ways to uh, come into the fold. This is a golden opportunity for the Middle East. This is not, or as the UN says, going to lead to greater chaos. I always laugh when I hear people say that there's experts, and I wonder and question where their expertise is derived from. And a lot of times they're just talking heads who are expressing their opinions. But if we look at the facts and we look at some of the historical context, we can see that this will clear a path for regional stability. There's several factors that are going to lead to the stabilization of the environment. The economic factors. If we look at the oil industry and the oil sector and how this can transition Iranian oil to a free market where it would eliminate the black market trade with Russia and China. It could allow for the oil the black market oil industry within Iraq to move away from that. So economics is going to play a part in that. The other is what we tend to forget is civil society. We can have politicians and governments advocating for their own interests, but what we're seeing and we could potentially see is the Iranian citizens backing and forming a new interim government or a coalition government. And really, that's what kind of the power that could be unleashed with this regime change and alignment of security and stability. Let me start by saying that Iran has threatened to close the Straits of Hormuz for decades. And as I said in a previous interview, they do not have the operational capability to do that. They don't have the wherewithal. And if they did, under free market economies, you are going to find workarounds. That could be a temporary disruption for a couple days, maybe a couple weeks, but the markets are going to find alternatives. And this is the capitalist society that we live in the interconnected world that we live in. So the idea of shutting down the Straits of Hormuz really is a threat with no backing. And if it did happen, it would be a temporary thing that would be overcome by the market. It has the potential to benefit the United States if it's done properly. Um, this is only one factor is the economic factor. All right. There's the stability factor, and an enduring peace will, as we say, a rising tide lifts all ships. And this is an opportunity to, not only help Iran, but Iraq and Syria and other countries in the Middle East. So this is a golden opportunity, and instead of focusing on the potential negative or downsides, we should be more optimistic and look at the upside potential and how it really could transform the Middle East. Nothing. This is rhetoric and this is political grandstanding. If we look at each of those countries, they have their own territorial and geographic matters and issues that they have to deal with. China vis-a-vis Taiwan, Russia vis-a-vis Ukraine. They do not have the wherewithal, they do not have the strategic capacity to be getting involved into this conflict. And as we've seen how Russia moved away from Syria after the Assad regime fell, China and it's a lot of talk about what they have, their strategic capabilities, but what have we seen from them at the tactical and operational levels? Not much. So if we believe that China and Russia are going to enter this conflict in any manner at any level, it's totally uh, something that we can talk about, but it's just not going to happen. It's just not a possibility. Yeah, I mean, what has Turkey done lately? They're still fighting with the Kurds in Kurdistan. They're worried about a separatist movement. They're worried about giving up territory for a Kurdish state. Once again, this is political posturing by Erdogan and the Turkish government. We're not going to see anything come out of Turkey, with regard to uh, anything aside from just political grandstanding and posturing to potentially support their strategic objectives. I said earlier that they will not do anything major. They're not good. First, they don't have the capability to launch major strikes. If they do have strikes, those strikes are going to be limited in their impact and their effect, and they'll be retaliated against by U.S. drone strikes or maybe special operations forces. But they don't have a capacity to do large scale strikes. I mean, look at how Hezbollah has played. Just launching missiles and UAVs. So it's not really a concern for the U.S., in my opinion. They have some capabilities, but like I said, they what have they done since the start of the Israeli airstrikes? They haven't done anything. Like I said, the factors that bind them to Iran have been taken away. So they've decoupled themselves in a way, and now they have to be independent on their own and fight for survival. And that is going to be through economic means. It's not going to enlarge the circle with regard to conflict, but it is going to have significant impact and change in the Middle East. And some of these countries are very aware of the changes in how this is going to impact them, especially when it comes to power and authority and some of the economics. If we look at Iran and Iraq, and we look at the corridor that's being built in Iraq right now, and we look at the economic potential with a with an alignment or a relationship, a peaceful relationship between Iraq and Iran, and that corridor being built, that takes billions of dollars in trade away from some of these other countries. So yes, they are very concerned about how this is going to impact them, and economically they fail, they can lose significant amounts of revenue and trade. So yeah, I see why a lot of these countries are concerned, and they're, but the political rhetoric doesn't support the concerns, and we really have to look at it through that lens to really understand why they're concerned. I kind of laugh when I hear about that. The world we live in will not allow for redrawing of territorial boundaries. That's just preposterous to believe that, you know, all of a sudden the US or Britain or the international community or the UN is going to have any ability to redraw these territorial boundaries. And just the idea of that, looking where we are at as a modern society, an interconnected society, you know, this is never going to happen. I can't really answer that question. And the reason why is there has been so much sectarian discord between in countries and between countries. That's never going to be resolved. I mean, that is going to be a conflict that continues and is an ongoing one. With regard to, is the United States playing the uh, sectarian card with regard to trying to advantage one group over another? I mean, that's been happening for millennia. Will the U.S. be directly involved in that? I can't answer that, but what I can say is the new administration seems to be focused on economics, money, and moving away from these enduring conflicts over sectarian violence. We've seen the war on terrorism, and under the administration of Bush Jr., this is a different administration, and people have to understand that this is not going to be the same, U.S. policy with regard to war on terrorism, fighting against ISIS. This is going to be one that looks at establishing a security environment that will flourish or allow the Middle East to flourish. So I will, that's a great question, and I will give you a very specific example. I put an article together and we talked about how the Trump's big Iran deal could benefit not only Iran but the region. And I spoke earlier about the pathway, the corridor that Iraq is building and how that can go into Iran and open up trade. But if we look at Iran and we remove the current regime and we replace it with an interim government, and then we start reducing the sanctions, not only on the oil industry, but overall. And then we start making investments in Iranian infrastructure. And then we allow the Iranian oil industry to prosper and integrate into the international uh, oil industry. All of a sudden now you have billions of dollars that can be reinvested into the country. And as you said, and as we all know, if you have economic stability, that will create stability within civil society. If we look at what's happening in Iraq and we say that the 65% of the population is not happy with the current government, and why? because there's a lack of resources, electricity, and things of that nature. And if Iraq was able to reinvest money back into their infrastructure, you would see less unrest. And that's the same model that can be applied to Iran. No, I don't believe that there was a positive environment in the negotiations. I believe each party had drawn red lines, and neither one wanted to cross those or give up anything with regard to Iran not giving up their nuclear enrichment capabilities, and the U.S. not backing down from trying to have Iran giving up their capabilities. So I don't believe they were good faith efforts. They were more of the typical, negotiations where you go to Doha or Geneva and you have your representatives go there and represent your what you want, but they were never in good faith, in my opinion. And frankly, what happened actually accelerated or allowed the things to happen that are occurring right now, which could lead to real negotiations that will lead to a peace agreement. Based upon what's happening now and the environment we're in, we have to assume that there is going to be a better environment between Iran and the United States. If we look at the history prior to the Iranian Revolution, there was a strategic relationship, partnerships between Iran and the United States, and it's not inconceivable that we can get back to that. What we have to understand is that's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take some time. The example that I gave you with regard to Iranian investments in Iranian infrastructure in the oil industry and the oil sector, that's, you know, 12, 18 months, 24 months. That's not going to happen overnight. So we have to understand, we have to be patient when we do this. We can't assume that all of a sudden we're going to have this instantaneous peace that's going to be, something that happens within a couple months. It's going to be a protracted campaign. It's going to take resources. It's going to take investment, and it's going to take good faith efforts on both sides. And it's also going to take key stakeholders like Iraq and Syria and Turkey and some of the Gulf states to help facilitate this. Yeah, I mean, that's not an easy question to answer. If we look at the investments of Gulf states in military equipment, a lot of that is posturing. They want the latest F-35. They want the latest tank. They have the money to purchase this. And a lot of that is for their egos. And when we look at some of the other countries that are making investments in military equipment, is that for self-protection or is that for power projection? So I understand that that's just one factor when we talk about, the kind of the relationships that are happening in the Middle East and how they evolve. And if we look at from a historical perspective, Iraq and Iran war and how long that lasted. But like I said, we have evolved so much since, you know, the early 2000s, in the late 1990s, and this is a different environment. And if we focus on the economics, if we focus on civil society, if we focus on what's important, we can move away from what's not important and move into a different kind of philosophical or ideological environment where peace and stability outweigh military superiority. This cannot last in perpetuity. It will come to an end. When that happens, a week from now, a day from now, a month from now, we can't ever understand what is going to be the factor that stops the war, but it will end eventually. With regard to the relationship between Iran and Israel, Tehran and Tel Aviv will never have a relationship as long as the current Iranian regime is in place. It just won't happen. Is there a possibility for Iran and Israel to develop an enduring relationship that's not hostile? Yes, but it will require a regime change in Iran. And that's the only way that that will ever happen. Well, this is a really interesting topic. We've seen the foreign minister put out statements previously, and it's almost like a toothless tiger. When you don't have any military capacity or it's degraded to a point where you don't have any power projection, the only thing you have left is words. And that's what they're using right now. And it, once again, we're going to have to watch this over the next couple days. But if you don't see any escalation from Iran, its proxy forces, you know, anyone else supporting Iran, they're basically on an island. They're alone and unafraid. They're going to have to come to the negotiation table, and they're going to have to give up major concessions. And one of those might be regime change, but that is going to be, we're going to see how that plays out. But what the foreign minister is doing is just all they have left, and that's rhetoric and words. They don't have a choice. I mean, their air defense capabilities have been degraded. Their economy is feeling the stress and impact of this right now. I've talked to people in Iraq. I've seen the reports how the trade is already being impacted between those two countries. If we look at what's happening within civil society, exodus from Tehran and other areas, we're seeing Iranians start to move into Armenia and other areas. You know, the regime can only hold on so long, and they have two choices: either they stay in power and make concessions, or they're going to be removed from power. We've clearly seen that Benjamin Netanyahu, his one of his goals is to eliminate the regime and regime change. So they are in a position where they have two options, and they're either going to remain in power and give up concessions, or they're going to be removed from power. It's a very simple equation. If I could answer that question, I would go to President Trump and tell him what the answer is. It's really difficult to answer that question because you really have to understand the psyche or the philosophy or the ideology behind the Ayatollah and the leadership. If they relinquish power, what happens to them? They're worrying about their own self-interests. They're worried about their future. So a lot of people will cling to that fact that they have to stay in power. That's all they've known for 20 years. And that giving up power is ultimately a death sentence to them. Do I believe that they have the capacity to do that? Yes. Do I believe that they're going to do it? No. I truly believe that they will you know, be martyrs, and they will try to cling to power as long as they can, because giving up authority and power, they have nothing left. And that's the unfortunate truth, is that even if they do come to the negotiating table, they want to remain in power, and that won't allow them to in good faith efforts make those concessions. So bottom line, I think it's going to be uh, a somewhat protracted campaign, but eventually it will lead to an enduring peace.